Good day. This is going to be an unusual program in that it is not going to be a program about a specific event, for example, a build-up of forces in eastern Ukraine, a quarrel between Britain and the European Union, a argument between the United States and China, or something like that. Rather, it is going to be a discussion about a feeling that I have that we have just been through this, the first half of this year, or rather the first quarter of this year, through through a watershed moment with something very big happening, which perhaps we don't fully understand, and certainly about which we don't have the full details. However, I'm going to say that I suspect that we have been through such a moment, an event which a very important Russian official is comparing to the Cuban Missile Crisis. And that Russian official, who is so important, is no less than the former president of Russia, Dmitry Medvedev, who has since been Prime Minister of Russia and who is now Deputy Chief of Russia's top policy-making body, the Security Council. Now, before saying and discussing the kind of things that Medvedev has been saying, I want to focus on who Medvedev is, because I think that there is a great deal of misunderstanding about Medvedev. Many people, and a blogger called the Saker is perhaps the best known, have positioned or posited that Medvedev is the leader within Russia of a group of people, the Atlantic integrationists, who seek to make Russia, in effect, a part of the collective West subordinate to the United States. I've never myself shared this view about Medvedev. On the contrary, it has always seemed to me that though he is somewhat more liberal than Putin in relation to the conduct of domestic policy, on foreign policy, he is, if anything, in general, more trenchant in his criticisms of the United States than Putin himself is. I think the idea of Medvedev as a leader of the Euro-Atlanticists or Atlantic integrationists within Russia stems from a misunderstanding caused by the fact that during the brief period of Medvedev's presidency, President Obama of the United States tried to make trouble between Medvedev and Putin, trying to play the two off against each other in order to try and create divisions within the Russian leadership, which the United States could exploit. That was the so-called reset policy, which the Obama administration adopted, and which it has since become clear was never intended in good faith. The point is, and it's a fact which is consistently overlooked, that policy of playing Medvedev off against Putin ended in complete failure. Medvedev always was extremely loyal to Putin and shared Putin's perspective on most international affairs, and it is the failure of that reset policy which in part accounts for the extraordinary anger that the United States has shown towards Putin ever since. Anyway, I digress. The key point to make about Medvedev is whatever you think about him, he is not just a former president of Russia, not just a former prime minister of Russia, but as deputy chief of the Security Council, he is someone who is in receipt of all of the top intelligence information provided by the Russian intelligence agencies to the Russian leadership, and is also someone who is extremely close to Putin himself. So what Medvedev says is authoritative. And perhaps what makes his recent comments, specifically an article he has written, even more interesting is where that article was published. It was published in English on the Sputnik website. This is a website run by Russia's Rossiya Sevodnya media organization, but one which is directed specifically and primarily at the outside world. It's not intended so much to be read by Russians, and so is clearly addressed at the United States and at the US leadership specifically. That is the only explanation for publishing an article of this nature in that website, coming from such an authoritative person within the Russian leadership. It is a statement of Russian opinions about what has happened, and it is addressed primarily to the new administration in the United States. And I'm now going to read that article in full. I'm sorry if this is going to take a little time, but I think it is an article of so much importance that I think reading it through is going to be extremely useful. It begins as follows. Avoiding a clash with great powers does not indicate cowardice, but wisdom, because sacrificing oneself is never an advantage anywhere. Preface to The Art of War by Sun Tzu by N. Conrad. In recent years, relations between Russia and the US have shifted from competitiveness to confrontation, effectively going back to the Cold War era. The sanctions pressure, threats, conflict behavior, and defense of selfish interests are plunging the world into a state of permanent instability. If relations between the two countries have been in the situation described above for a long time, it is called a crisis. Such crises provide a fertile ground for even more acute periods in the relationship, a crisis of all crises. Under such circumstances, any faux pas, any lack of patience, and any strategic understanding of the weight of each word could plunge not just two countries, but the entire world into an abyss of the gravest challenges, threatening it with a direct military clash. This has happened before in our common history. The time was a little different than now, and the scene was in the Caribbean, but the spirit of what was going on was very similar. US foreign policy at the time forced our country to respond accordingly. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, it was manifested in the deployment of American missiles in Turkey, in South Vietnam, and in Lebanon, as well in the failed policies towards Cuba that sparked the revolution, and then again in an attempt to regain control of the island of freedom, and in many other things. Today, it has manifested itself in anti-Russian sanctions, an orchestrated harassment campaign against Russia, US policy towards our neighbouring countries, NATO's final approach to our borders, opposition to Nord Stream 2, concerns about our country's development of the Northern Sea route, and finally the Ukrainian crisis. We see examples of such policies on a daily basis. The Russia of today, as with the Soviet Union of the past, has always been in catch-up position with the United States on the level of threats to its counterpart. In the early 1960s, the Soviet Union responded to the Americans by deploying strategic offensive weapons to Cuba. The United States, as we know, had taken a further confrontational step by bringing in warships, imposing a naval blockade on the island, and even preparing a full-scale invasion. That became known as the Cuban Missile Crisis. There are two key points in this framework. The first, a long-term response, involved more than just the deployment of missiles off the coast of the United States. Above all, It was a demonstration, and more importantly, a realization by Western countries of our state's infrastructural capabilities to deploy military bases anywhere in the world at short notice. The second, a situation just 5 minutes from war, was saved by the leaders of the two superpowers retaining a sober assessment of the standoff, who recognized and accepted the wisdom of compromise and hence were prepared to make concessions. At some points, the leaders communicated directly, at others they did not. But in any case, there was dialogue between the Soviet Union and the United States on an equal footing, pursued not through the language of threats and ultimatums. After the resolution of the 20th century Cuban Missile Crisis, there has never been a situation since where the two countries were this close to war, because both had learnt the lesson that cooperation in solving international problems was better than confrontation. But today, the situation is somewhat different. The US has slid into an unstable foreign policy. This manifested itself in the rejection of the Iran nuclear deal and in the US withdrawal from the Open Skies Treaty and several other international treaties, and at the moment in the rhetoric of the new US president. The new strategic reality, the instability of Washington's foreign policy, is largely caused by domestic reasons, but also by a certain decline in the credibility of the United States as the leader of the Western world. A new tactic of the US administration is to signal the need for dialogue on the one hand and increase pressure with the other. It can speak both of the fulfillment of the Democrats' campaign promises and a lack of unity in policy making and decision making in the new team, and of an American holy mission. We are always right, you must listen to us. Both partners and opponents ought to take this course for granted with a sense of gratitude of the lesson learned. We heard calls for dialogue during a telephone conversation between the two presidents. And then tough rhetoric kicked in. New anti-Russian sanctions were imposed, diplomats were expelled, and an executive order on the Russian threat was signed. This should also include the artificially fueled conflict in eastern Ukraine, militaristic statements by the US leadership, and the redeployment of military equipment to our region. To put it simply, the situation is escalating. It was clear that the United States perceived the Soviet Union as an equal opponent which should undoubtedly be reckoned with. This was because the parties had military political parity and the system of international organizations was set up to preserve this balance. Two military blocs, NATO and the Warsaw Pact, accounted for this too. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union, this parity was lost for a while. The United States, having lived for 1.5 decades in a coordinate system where no other country in the world not only had comparable power to it, but not even the hypothetical right to have such power, has simply made the United States unaccustomed to equitable dialogue. The new US administration, re-establishing its position as the world leader and protector of the collective West, whilst in parallel persuading itself of this, does not have the fortitude to recognize that someone in the world may have infrastructural capabilities and military political capacity comparable to themselves. For example, China or Russia. The question on the agenda is whether the current US administration will find the wisdom of compromise that the leaders of the Caribbean crisis of the 1960s reached, and what can help to diffuse problems when the situation is heated to the point of breaking point. There are three such points. First, an understanding of the price of a fatal decision. If the damage from winning is so extensive that it raises doubts about the continued existence of the winner, then it is not victory. Second, direct communication. It is not just a phone you can use, but an opportunity to speak frankly and, more importantly, to hear your counterpart and to understand their logic and arguments. And third, which is most important, not only an understanding of the necessity and possibility of compromises, but also a willingness to make those compromises, a willingness to reject the language of ultimatums and disgraceful behavior that drives the dialogue down below ground level. This is why rhetoric boiled down to the crude phrase, Russia will pay the price, whilst sounding very American, leads straight to a dead end. There is no way out of this tunnel. This mantra will offer no enlightenment to anyone. Now, that is an extraordinarily interesting article, and the starting point I'm going to make is that Medvedev is directly comparing the situation today with the situation which existed during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Moreover, he actually uses the expression Cuban Missile Crisis, which, to my mind, confirms conclusively that his words are addressed directly to the US leadership. The Russians do not refer to the Cuban Missile Crisis. They call it the Caribbean Crisis, which, by the way, Medvedev does in the second part of his article or essay. So the fact that he calls it the Cuban Missile Crisis means that his words are intended directly to address the leadership of the United States. Secondly, Medvedev clearly identifies the United States as being responsible for this deterioration in relations. He speaks about the policies of the United States that have led to an escalation of the crisis. And this is what he says. He refers to anti-Russian sanctions, an orchestrated harassment campaign against Russia, US policy towards our neighboring countries. Here he's clearly referring to Belarus and Ukraine first and foremost, but you could also add Georgia, Moldova, and even Armenia and the Caucasus to that mix. NATO's final approach to our borders, the military deployments which have been taking place in Poland and the Baltic states, is clearly what he's referring to. Opposition to Nord Stream 2, concerns about our country's development of the Northern Sea route, that is, the route opening maritime transport from the Far East to Europe via the Arctic, which is now becoming open due to climate change and Russia's massive development of its nuclear-powered icebreaking fleet. And then finally, the Ukrainian crisis. Now, what he is essentially saying is that just as in the 1950s and early 1960s, where the United States was pushing a policy of what he called at that time rollback against the Soviet Union, today the United States has been piling on the pressure against Russia on all fronts. But the point he's also making is that the Russians today, as in the 1950s and in the early 1960s, are pushing back. The way they pushed back in the early 1960s was by building the Berlin Wall and by establishing, by installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. That brought the world to the edge of crisis, the United States, as Medvedev rightly says, threatened to invade Cuba and also imposed a naval blockade on Cuba. What Medvedev doesn't point out, but what is known to both the US and Russian leaderships, is that these policies that the United States followed during the Cuban Missile Crisis actually brought the world to the brink of war. The Soviets, during the course of the Cuban Missile Crisis, made it very clear to the US that if there was a US invasion of Cuba, the Soviet Union would retaliate by occupying West Berlin. And it has since been confirmed that, unknown to the United States at the time, the Soviet missiles in Cuba were already activated, and the Soviet commanders in Cuba were itching to launch them against the United States. As Medvedev rightly says, the crisis was eventually diffused as a result of direct communications between President Kennedy of the United States and Nikita Khrushchev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and also through a dialogue that was going on via the Soviet embassy in Washington between Robert Kennedy, President Kennedy's brother, and at that time the Attorney General of the United States, and Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. That discussion ended in compromises which were not disclosed at the time because the Soviets wanted, for various reasons, to buttress President Kennedy's position in the United States. But those compromises involved an agreement by the Soviets to withdraw their missiles from Cuba in return for the United States making giving a private undertaking not to invade Cuba and agreeing privately to withdraw its missiles from Turkey, Lebanon, and South Vietnam, as insisted upon by the Soviets. That was the compromise which diffused the Cuban Missile Crisis, and as Medvedev hints, it led to a dramatic de-escalation of tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States. The following year, in 1963, the Soviets and the Americans, and by the way the British, agreed the so-called nuclear test ban treaty, whereby the Soviets, the United States, and the British agreed that they would no longer carry out nuclear tests in the atmosphere. In 1967, there was a summit meeting in Glassboro in the United States between US President Lyndon Johnson and Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin, which basically initiated the program known as détente, the period known as détente. The following year, 1968, the United States and the Soviet Union, as well as many other countries, agreed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which pledged both of these countries and their allies not to share nuclear technology with other states and to aim towards the destruction of nuclear weapons and a nuclear-free world. And discussions were then initiated towards further arms control measures, which led to the Outer Space Treaty, which prohibited the deployment of nuclear weapons in space, the 1972 Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, and the 1972 SALT I Treaty, which limited the two superpowers' strategic arms. There were also negotiations which eventually led in 1975 to the conclusion of the Helsinki Final Act, which sought to de-escalate tensions in Europe by recognizing the borders that had been established following the end of the Second World War. And also there was an agreement about Berlin, which basically de-escalated the festering crisis which had grown there. That was a period between roughly 1962 and the mid-1970s, when the situation between the two superpowers of that time, the Soviet Union and the United States, improved markedly. There was a de-escalation of tensions, and the United States and the Soviet Union were able for a time to concentrate on their own affairs and not threaten each other or threaten world peace and global destruction via a nuclear war. Well, that period of détente ended in the 1980s, but was then to some extent patched together again by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan, and events then followed which led to the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and that unipolar moment which Medvedev talks about, in which the United States came to think of itself not just as a superpower, but as the world's hyperpower and the country, the exceptional country, which could dictate across the world the future of international relations. What Medvedev is saying in this article is that the United States' attempt to cling on to that position that it achieved in the 1990s of being, in its own perception, the world's hyperpower, is both dangerous and obsolete. It fails to recognize that the situation today in the world is closer to that which existed in the late 1950s and early 1960s, when there were two superpowers facing off against each other. This time, it is not the United States versus the Soviet Union. This time, it is the United States versus Russia and China, or, as Medvedev is careful to say, Russia or China. Russia and China, each and of themselves, possesses what Medvedev calls infrastructural capabilities, that is to say, military political power, comparable to what the Soviet Union had in relation to the United States in the early 1960s, and in effect, which is something that Medvedev does not say, are also in effective alliance with each other. This is the new geopolitical reality to which the United States has not adjusted. And what Medvedev says is that if the United States continues in its attempts to disregard these geopolitical realities by piling on pressure on Russia and by piling on pressure on China, it will find itself at some point on the brink of war, exactly as it did in 1962 during the Cuban Missile Crisis. However, I think it goes beyond this. I mean, this is in a sense a historical comparison between the events of the early 1960s and the events of today. But I think what Medvedev is hinting at is something that goes much beyond this. Because, of course, we have seen lots of things happen over the first half of this year. We've seen an attempted coup in Belarus, or at least that's what the Russians say. And I come back to what Putin said about the US policies towards our neighboring countries. And clearly, one of the things he's hinting at in that phrase is the attempted coup in Belarus. But of course, he also refers to the Ukrainian crisis. And in fact, he talks about this at some considerable length. He says, for example, how this crisis has been escalated and has blown out of control, and he also calls it artificial. The artificially fueled conflict in eastern Ukraine, militaristic statements by the US leadership, and the redeployment of military equipment to our region. Now, all of that suggests that the Russians, at least in their perception, feel that the United States attempted a major push against them at the beginning of this year, in the first half of this year, comparable to what they faced in the early 1960s, and that we have been through something rather like a Cuban Missile Crisis moment. There was the attempted coup in Belarus. The Russians insist that actually happened, and as I've discussed in a recent program, there is reason to think that may be so. And of course, there was that major deployment of the Ukrainian army to the contact line and the collapse of the ceasefire there. There was also the planned deployment of US Navy warships to the Black Sea, something which, as I've discussed, clearly was not decided upon in anticipation of Russian movements, but was clearly planned to be synchronized with the Ukrainian deployments. And of course, there was the rollout of the sanctions against Russia, which Medvedev complains about, the enormous pressure on Nord Stream 2, and of course, there was also much talk about a cyber attack, which may have been targeted at Russia, but which Putin, in his recent speech to the Federal Assembly, hints may really have been intended to be used as part of the coup, the alleged coup, that was supposed to take place in Belarus. Now, the Russians clearly took steps to respond to all of these actions. Firstly, they were able to stifle the alleged coup in Belarus. They were obviously fully aware of what was going on there. They've rounded up many of the coup plotters, and it's been confirmed today, as I speak, that a trial is underway with several of the people involved apparently having confessed to their roles in the attempted coup. So that's the first thing. Then, of course, there was the major Russian build-up of forces on the Ukrainian border and the strong statements made by many officials within the Russian leadership, including Putin, and of course also including Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, that in the event of a Ukrainian attack on the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic, there would be an overwhelming military response from Russia, which could very well lead to the destruction of Ukraine as a state. And then there was the closure by Russia of the Kerch Strait and the Sea of Azov to US and NATO naval vessels. And also there were the warnings from Russia that any NATO warships that did enter the Black Sea should steer clear, keep far away from Russia's coast. Warnings which the United States heeded by withdrawing its two destroyers from the Black Sea. The British, as I've discussed in another program, have foolishly sent their warships into the Black Sea, and the US, for its part, has now sent a US Coast Guard cutter, which is, of course, a purely symbolic deployment, which is not going to unnerve the Russians one bit. Anyway, that's what we know has happened, but I'm going to make a guess that behind the scenes there's been more going on than just that. I suspect that the Russians have made it very clear that if there was a war in eastern Ukraine, there would be more and more severe consequences. I'm not going to try and guess what those consequences were, but no doubt the Russians were conscious of the fact that there would have been sanctions imposed on them, but clearly they had plans for counter-sanctions also. In addition, we know for a fact that the Russians have now taken strong action to squelch Navalny's movement in Russia itself. Today, as I'm making this program, we learned that he's going to be the target of further charges connected to the activities of his organization, which the Russian authorities are now labeling an extremist movement, and that the Russians are taking steps to close down all of the various Western NGOs that operate in their country and which they see as promoting regime change there. I'm going to guess, however, that the Russians had even more moves in mind, and who knows what they were, but they might have involved things like, for all I know, cyber attacks or more military deployments or activities that perhaps it's difficult for us to judge. I expect anyway that there was very intense discussions going on between the United States and Russia throughout this period, and specifically and overall, there were the clear warnings about a possible Russian military action in Ukraine to resolve the crisis there. Now, I've also said in many programs that faced by those Russian warnings, the West pulled back on Ukraine. Biden telephoned Putin to call for a de-escalation. Merkel and Macron have done the same. The Ukrainians have been forced to drop any plans they might have had for an offensive in eastern Ukraine, and they're now desperately looking for some face-saving way of pulling their own troops back, with Zelensky desperately calling for a summit meeting. His latest suggestions is that Putin and Zelensky meet in, of all places, the Vatican. Well, there we are. Perhaps the most interesting points, however, that Medvedev makes is that even as he understands and acknowledges the fact that there is a desire or a seeming desire on the part of the United States to de-escalate, he also talks about the unstable nature of US foreign policy. The US has slid into an unstable foreign policy. And he goes on to say about how the new team lacks unity in policy making and decision making as the United States continues to struggle with its supposed holy mission. We are always right, you must listen to us, and we have a right to impose lessons on you. What I think Medvedev is talking about or discussing here is the dysfunctional nature of the US administration, the fact that the Russians perceive the US leadership as weak and unable to impose its ideas on the bureaucracy, and pulled in different directions, sometimes wanting to take strong action against Russia, which are inconsistent with its wishes for a dialogue with Russia. And the Russians are saying that if there is going to be such a dialogue, it must be consistent, just as it was in the 1960s, and it must result in the US making important compromises which essentially acknowledge Russia's red lines. Those are the red lines that Putin was speaking about in his speech to the Russian Parliament, the Federal Assembly. Now, again, we don't know fully what those red lines are, but we can actually make some shrewd guesses based on what the Russians have said in the past. Firstly, they are no interference by the United States in Russian internal affairs. That is to say, no further attempts by the United States to back people like Navalny within Russia. And secondly, a US acceptance that countries like Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, and Georgia are part of Russia's sphere of influence, and that they will not be drawn into NATO or the European Union. And Medvedev makes it very clear that this is what the Russians expect the US to move towards if they really want to avoid a situation where the crisis that took place in the first part of this year does not lead to or escalate into the kind of standoff the United States found itself in 1962 in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where it faced an existential threat. Medvedev talks about the need for the United States to reach an understanding and the necessity and possibility of compromises, but also a willingness to make those compromises. So, an acceptance by the United States that it must recognize that there is to be no further interference in Russian internal affairs, and acceptance by the United States that Russia has an effective sphere of influence over the countries that make up the former Soviet Union, including Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Moldova, and the rest. But thirdly, I suspect non-interference in Russian economic projects like Nord Stream 2, the Arctic Sea Route, and the rest. If all that happens, there will be not friendship or peace between the United States and Russia. I think the Russians are under no illusions that that will happen, but at least what you might call a geopolitical ceasefire, a situation where the situation in Europe is broadly stable, with neither the United States nor Russia taking measures against each other, and with the United States and Russia able, from that point on, to focus on their economic and social problems. The United States, with an enormously ambitious program recently announced by the Biden administration, Russia with its continued attempts or program to systematically and methodically rebuild its economy and reintegrate economically the territories of the former Soviet Union, which have been a long-standing objective of the Russian leadership. So that's it. That is where I think we are. I think we came very close this year, perhaps not exactly to a Cuban Missile Crisis type situation, but something not very far removed from it. And I think that the United States has actually picked up on this. The latest words from the Biden administration towards Russia have all been conciliatory, about the United States wanting to de-escalate, about the United States wanting to avoid a downward spiral in relations with Russia, about the United States wanting to press ahead with arms control. Biden spoke in exactly that way again during his State of the Union address, and it's notable that even US officials like Jen Psaki, who have a background of making hawkish statements about Russia in the past, also seem to be talking in a similar way. Again, I can't help but think that what has probably caused this change of tone, this dramatic change of tone in the administration, from the confrontational language we were hearing at the start of this year, is the shiver of fear that took place during the situation in Ukraine, and the fear that the United States might find itself in a situation, if not exactly analogous to the Cuban Missile Crisis, to something not far removed from it, with the Russian army destroying Ukraine and the United States humiliated as it found itself unable to do anything about it. Well, will we get this geopolitical ceasefire? Other Russian officials have confirmed that discussions about a summit meeting between Putin and Biden, a summit meeting first suggested by Biden, are still underway. Apparently, the talk is that this summit will happen in June. It's not clear which city, though Vienna must remain the leading possibility. We shall see. But that, it seems to me, is the situation at the moment. We are at a crossroads between possible détente and further confrontation. The United States has suffered some kind of major setback, so it seems to me, in its attempts to destabilize Russia at the start of this year. The Russians reacted far more strongly in Ukraine than they anticipated. They squelched the attempted coup in Belarus. They countered the cyber attack that was supposed to happen there. And above all, they have squelched the Navalny organization in a way that makes it absolutely clear as crystal that they're not going to tolerate any more attempts at interference in their internal affairs. And the overall effect has been a dampener on the more neocon policies that the administration appeared to follow. We've had the talk about a summit, the proposal of a summit from the United States, and the talk of de-escalation. The neocons, however, who are the people who drive all these hardline confrontational policies, remain in place. They continue to have that same visceral hostility towards Russia that they always have done. We will see who wins out. Those people in the United States and in the administration, possibly Biden himself, possibly Secretary Blinken, possibly Defense Secretary Austin, I suspect most definitely National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan and CIA Director William Burns, or the more hardline figures like Victoria Nuland and the various other neocon officials, most of whom are permanent officials who remain embedded in the National Security Council. Will it be the first group who have a more realistic understanding of the limits of the United States and of its power? Or will it be the more hardline figures like Victoria Nuland, her husband Robert Kagan, who refuse to accept that US power has any limits? We shall see. If it is the first group, then we could see an easing of tensions, though I doubt that it will amount to anything as fully developed as the détente that took place in the 1960s and 1970s. If it is the second group, then we are in for a very dangerous period of confrontation. Medvedev complains about the unstable foreign policy position in Washington. He is right. It's difficult at this moment to say which of these two factions will win out. The future, the immediate future, and perhaps the prospects of peace depends on which of those two groups does win out in this battle in Washington. Thank you for joining me for this prolonged program on this complex topic. I look forward to you joining me in future videos on this channel, and thank you for joining me on this channel for this program. Please also join me on other channels, on my other main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Please also remember to check out Alex's channel. You will find links under this video. Please also check us out on BitChute, Library, and Rumble, our other platforms, and especially on Odyssey, by the way. Please also support us to the extent that you can if you like this kind of analysis and commentary that we provide and that I provide on this channel via Patreon, Subscribestar, and PayPal. And remember, we accept donations in all currencies, including the new electronic ones. Please also check us out on our Discord server. And last but not least, go to our shop, buy yourself the famous magic mugs you will find there, the amazing t-shirts, the hats, the hoodies, the sweatshirts, and the famous t-shirts, all of A1 quality, all fabulous to wear and own, and also you support the Duran by buying them. And thank you for joining me on this complex but I think important topic, and I look forward to you joining me again, and have a wonderful day until we speak soon.